The courtroom burst into laughter as Keanu Reeves stood silent, until he calmly placed a silver badge on the table. The room froze. A United States Secret Service badge, real, official, and dangerous. But what Keanu revealed next wasn't just shocking, it was a warning. And no one in that room would ever be the same again. Before we continue this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe to the channel, because tomorrow we have another inspiring story you won't want to miss. The Wyoming morning was crisp, and the air carried a kind of quiet that only wide-open spaces can hold. Keanu Reeves had traded in the bright lights of Hollywood for a simpler life. His ranch, tucked away in the foothills outside Jackson, was peaceful. Horses roamed the pastures, the distant sound of wind chimes danced through the air, and Keanu spent his days riding his motorcycle along winding dirt roads or working with his hands in the workshop behind his house. To most of the locals, he was just another quiet man who preferred his own company. They saw him at the general store, picking up supplies. They saw him volunteering at the children's hospital on weekends, sitting with kids in the oncology ward, reading them stories with that same calm voice that once commanded the silver screen. They knew he donated quietly to local orphanages and funded college scholarships for kids who had aged out of foster care, but they didn't really know him. Keanu liked it that way. But peace, like all things, was temporary. The dispute started with a letter from the Jackson County Zoning Board. His newly built guest house, tucked along the northern edge of his property, apparently violated county ordinances. It exceeded the size limitations by more than a few square feet, and according to the letter, it had to be brought into compliance or be torn down. At first, Keanu quietly reviewed the paperwork. He measured twice, cross-checked the regulations, and even walked the perimeter himself. He hadn't built the structure on a whim. There was a purpose for its size, and that purpose wasn't something he was ready to share. His team urged him to let lawyers handle it. After all, zoning disputes in this county could get messy. Judges here didn't take kindly to outsiders, even if those outsiders were Hollywood legends. But Keanu didn't bring in the lawyers. He didn't call in favors. He didn't send letters from some high-powered legal firm in Los Angeles. He quietly filled out the court paperwork himself and filed it with the county clerk. Then he waited. "Are you sure about this?" his assistant Michael asked him one evening as they stood on the wraparound porch. "You know, Judge Atkins already thinks you're just another entitled actor, throwing his weight around." Keanu stood with his arms crossed, gazing at the horizon as the sun dipped behind the Tetons. His voice was steady. "Some things matter more than appearances." Michael sighed. "You could at least bring a lawyer with you." Keanu shook his head. "I built it. I'll answer for it." The hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning. Most zoning cases like this were handled quickly, 10 minutes at most. Locals came to watch because they heard Keanu Reeves was showing up in person. No entourage, no fancy car, just Keanu, driving himself to the courthouse in an old pickup truck that had seen better days. By the time he arrived, the small courtroom was already packed. Ranchers, store owners, even a group of high school kids skipping class crowded into the gallery. Murmurs spread as he walked in. Some were curious. Others were amused. A few were openly dismissive. "Hollywood showing up for a fence dispute," one man chuckled. "I bet he'll pull the movie star card," another said. Keanu walked quietly to the defendant's table. He didn't wave. He didn't acknowledge the whispers. He simply sat down, opened his worn leather notebook, and waited. Judge Amos Atkins was known in these parts for his no-nonsense attitude. A man in his 60s with a belly that tested the limits of his suspenders and a thinning patch of white hair that barely clung to his scalp. He adjusted his glasses as he shuffled through the papers on his desk, clearly in no hurry to get started. When he finally glanced up at Keanu, his eyes held a hint of amusement. "Well," Atkins said, "I've seen your movies, Mr. Reeves. Didn't expect to see you in my courtroom. What brings you here instead of sending in one of your high-prized Los Angeles lawyers?" Keanu's response was simple. "It's my property. I thought it made sense I speak for it." There was a light laugh from the gallery. Atkins smirked. "Fair enough, but let me give you a little heads up. Out here, we follow the law. Doesn't matter who you are." Keanu nodded once, his expression unreadable. "Understood." Atkins looked down at the papers again, flipping to the highlighted section that described the guest house in question. "Seems like you built yourself a second house rather than a guest house. That's the issue here. Too big, too far from the main residence, no permit." Keanu didn't flinch. "I built it with a purpose." Atkins raised a brow. "Care to share what that purpose is?" Keanu's gaze stayed steady. "Not yet." More whispers spread across the room. Atkins leaned back in his chair. "Well, that's going to make this a short hearing." As the gavel came down to officially begin the proceedings, a storm was brewing just beneath the surface. What no one realized, what no one could have realized, was that this wasn't about property lines, square footage, or county regulations. Keanu had built that guest house for a reason. And very soon, the quiet man they thought they knew would show them exactly why appearances can be deceiving. The wooden gavel struck once, a sharp crack that echoed through the small Wyoming courtroom. Judge Amos Atkins adjusted his glasses and leaned forward with an expression that mixed amusement with mild annoyance. "Let's get this on the record," he announced, flipping open the case file. "Zoning dispute between Jackson County and Keanu Reeves." A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the gallery. There was an unmistakable undertone of mockery in the air. Many of those seated in the wooden pews of the courthouse had come for a show, not justice. After all, how often did a famous actor show up at a county hearing over a simple building violation? It was the kind of small-town entertainment people talked about for weeks. Judge Atkins read the file out loud. "You built a structure on your property, Mr. Reeves, a guest house as you describe it. But this guest house exceeds the maximum square footage allowed under Jackson County Code. It's also located beyond the permissible distance from the main dwelling." He glanced up. "That's what brings you here today." Keanu sat still, his hands resting quietly on the table before him. He wore a simple, dark blazer over a gray shirt, his black hair falling just past his shoulders. He didn't speak right away. When he finally did, his tone was calm, almost gentle. "I built it for a reason, Your Honor." The judge gave a dismissive snort. "I'm sure you did. Everyone has reasons. But the law is the law, even for you." There was another wave of quiet chuckling from the gallery. Judge Atkins didn't try to stop it. If anything, he seemed to enjoy the subtle humiliation he thought he was delivering. He continued, his tone thick with sarcasm. "Now, I've enjoyed your movies, Mr. Reeves, I really have, but this isn't Hollywood. Out here, we don't hand out special treatment to movie stars." Keanu gave a slow nod. "I'm not asking for special treatment." Atkins smirked. "Then why are we here? Why not just tear the thing down and be done with it? The rules are pretty simple." The room was quiet for a beat. All eyes were on Keanu. The way he sat so still, the way he didn't react to the judge's condescending tone. It unsettled some of the people watching, but they weren't sure why. Finally, Keanu spoke. "Because it's not just a guest house." Atkins leaned back, tapping his pen against the wood. "No? Then what is it?" Keanu didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached slowly into his jacket pocket. The bailiff, standing nearby, instinctively tensed. There was a subtle shift in the room as people sat up straighter. No one spoke. Keanu's movements were deliberate, measured. He withdrew something small and metallic and placed it on the table in front of him. It gleamed under the overhead lights. For a few seconds, no one reacted. Judge Atkins squinted, leaning forward. His sarcastic tone faltered. "What's this supposed to be?" he asked. Keanu's gaze didn't waver. His voice remained level. "United States Secret Service." The silence that followed was absolute. It felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. Judge Atkins froze. His fingers hovered above the desk, motionless. The gallery, once murmuring and smug, now sat in stunned stillness. Atkins reached out slowly, as if touching something fragile. His pudgy fingers brushed over the surface of the badge. He turned it, studying it with growing unease. It was real, not a movie prop, not some clever replica. The weight of it was obvious even from where the others sat. "Secret Service?" he said, though it sounded more like a question to himself. Keanu nodded once. Yes. Atkins blinked rapidly. His earlier amusement had drained away, replaced by something else entirely. "Mr. Reeves," he said slowly, this isn't in your file." "It wouldn't be," Keanu replied. The judge licked his lips. A small bead of sweat formed at his temple. "You're telling me you worked for—" Keanu tilted his head slightly. "I was part of an operations group under the United States Secret Service, deep cover assignments, years ago." Whispers spread like wildfire through the room. The spectators who had come to enjoy the humiliation of an aging actor were now glancing at each other with expressions that ranged from disbelief to fear. Some of them instinctively leaned away, as though proximity to Keanu might somehow pull them into something they weren't prepared to face. Atkins cleared his throat. "And this guest house?" "It's not for guests," Keanu said softly. "It's a safe house." The judge's face went pale. "A safe house," he repeated. Keanu's steady voice cut through the tension. "I built it according to protocol. Reinforced structure, independent power, water filtration, satellite communications. It's designed to withstand a level of threat that goes far beyond a zoning dispute." For several long moments, no one spoke. Then Atkins found his voice again. "But why? Why here? Why now?" Keanu gave him a long look. "Because certain things are moving again. Things we thought were buried. And I need a place where I can protect people. Where I can regroup if it comes to that." The courtroom remained frozen. The judge stared at the badge in front of him as if it might reveal answers he wasn't ready to hear. His fingers trembled ever so slightly as he set it down on the table. "You're telling me," he said carefully, "that the zoning violation on your property is related to national security?" Keanu nodded. "Yes." Atkins ran a hand over his face. His earlier confidence had completely vanished. "Why wasn't this disclosed? Why didn't you tell me this from the beginning?" Keanu's gaze didn't shift. "Because you wouldn't have believed me, not until you saw that." He nodded toward the badge. Atkins looked at it again. He wasn't the only one. Several people in the gallery craned their necks for a better view, their earlier amusement replaced by something more akin to fear. The judge sat back slowly in his chair, exhaling a shaky breath. This changes things." Keanu said nothing. Atkins wiped his brow. I'll need confirmation, clearance. This is beyond my authority." Keanu nodded again. "Do what you need to do." But as he spoke, something subtle shifted in the room. The people who had come to laugh at Keanu Reeves now sat silent. They realized, maybe for the first time, that the man who had made a career playing heroes on screen had lived a far more dangerous life off it. Judge Atkins cleared his throat. His hands fumbled with the papers in front of him. He was trying to find his place again, trying to remember why they were all here. But nothing felt simple anymore. We'll adjourn for now," he said, his voice unsteady. "Pending further investigation." The gavel struck once more. This time, it sounded less like authority and more like a warning. As the courtroom slowly emptied, people cast glances at Keanu, some curious, some respectful, a few afraid. And as he gathered his things and stood, Keanu glanced at the badge one last time before slipping it quietly back inside his jacket. For most, the case had been a curiosity, a bit of gossip to fill the quiet Wyoming days. Now, it was something else entirely. The man they thought they knew had just shown them he was much more than a movie star. And the danger he hinted at? It hadn't even begun. Judge Amos Atkins sat frozen, his hand hovering over the silver badge that still rested on the courtroom table. His breathing was shallow, his brow damp with sweat. The courtroom that once buzzed with quiet laughter and derision was now suffocatingly silent. Even the wooden walls seemed to lean in, waiting for what Keanu Reeves would say next. For a few moments, neither man spoke. Then Judge Atkins cleared his throat, though the sound came out thin and dry. He straightened his glasses with trembling fingers. "This is highly irregular," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. His voice echoed in the stillness. He tried again, louder. "Mr. Reeves, Keanu, this isn't in the file." Keanu remained calm, his dark eyes steady, unflinching. It wouldn't. The judge's jaw clenched. He was struggling to keep control of the room, of himself. His hands moved to the gavel as if its familiar weight might ground him, but the symbol of authority he'd relied on for years felt smaller now. "You're telling me you were a federal agent," Atkins said. "Secret Service. Before all this?" Keanu gave the smallest nod. "Long before." The words settled into the space between them, heavy as iron. Atkins ran a hand through his thinning hair. He glanced around the room, but the spectators were already moving toward the exits, murmuring anxiously among themselves. They didn't want to be here anymore. No one did. "Explain," the judge said finally, though his voice was less a demand and more a plea. "Explain how a movie star ends up flashing a Secret Service badge in my courtroom." Keanu exhaled slowly. He hadn't wanted it to come to this, but the time for holding back had passed. "I was recruited before the films," he began, "before anyone knew my name, Special Division, off the books. They called it Blackthorne." The name hung in the air, foreign and sharp, as if uttering it might summon something from the dark. "Blackthorne?" Judge Atkins repeated, confused. "What is that, some kind of military unit?" Keanu shook his head slowly. "Not military. Blackthorne was built for missions that never made it into official reports, the kind of work you deny if anyone asks. If you're lucky, no one ever asks." The judge's hands trembled slightly, despite himself. He flexed his fingers against the desk. "Why you?" His voice cracked at the edges. "Why would they recruit an actor?" "I wasn't an actor," Keanu replied simply. "Not yet. I was a ghost. The movies came after. They were a mask, a way to disappear in plain sight." Atkins swallowed hard. "And this guest house? This zoning violation?" He gestured toward the papers scattered on his desk. "You're telling me it's not a violation at all?" "It's a fail-safe," Keanu said. "A place to disappear, to protect others, to hold out if the wrong people come looking." Judge Atkins laughed suddenly, a sharp, nervous bark. "This is insane," he muttered, shaking his head. "You expect me to believe you built a secret government safe house in Jackson County, Wyoming? In my jurisdiction? That you've been living under my nose while, planning for a war?" Keanu's expression didn't change. "Not planning for war," he said quietly. "Trying to avoid one." The judge exhaled sharply through his nose. "Well, Mr. Reeves, this changes nothing. I don't care if you've got a badge from the Secret Service, the CIA, or NASA. This doesn't change the law." Keanu leaned forward slightly. His voice was calm, but the weight behind it was undeniable. "It changes the stakes." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other. The judge's gaze flickered toward the badge again, then toward Keanu's hands, steady on the table. His stomach churned. "Who?" Atkins finally asked. "Who's coming for you?" Keanu was silent at first, then, "I don't know yet. But I know the signs. Someone's cleaning house. Blackthorne was supposed to be dismantled, erased, but old programs leave old enemies. And they've started moving again." Atkins leaned back in his chair as though putting distance between himself and the words might make them less real. "And you're next," he said quietly. Keanu nodded once. "Unless I stay ahead of them?" The judge's hands trembled more now. He clenched them in his lap beneath the table, hoping Reeves hadn't noticed. But of course, He had. Keanu's voice softened. "I'm not asking for favors, Judge. I came here because I thought I could handle this quietly. But I need that safe house. If they take it from me, I'm exposed." There was a knock on the side door of the courtroom. Both men turned. The bailiff stepped inside, his face pale. He moved quickly to the judge's bench and leaned in close, whispering something that made the color drain from Judge Atkins' face entirely. "Who?" Atkins whispered. The bailiff swallowed. "Homeland Security," he murmured. "There's an agent here. He says it's urgent." Keanu didn't move. He sat still, watching. Atkins glanced at Keanu, then back at the bailiff. "Clear the courtroom," he ordered. In moments, the last of the spectators were gone. The room felt emptier, colder. Even the light seemed dimmer. The side door opened again, and a tall man in a dark suit stepped inside. He moved with precision, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on Keanu. He approached slowly, his badge already in hand. "Judge Atkins," the man said smoothly. "Special Agent Marcus Dean, Department of Homeland Security." Atkins nodded stiffly. "Agent Dean, I assume this isn't a coincidence." Dean's eyes flicked to Keanu again. "No, sir." Atkins glanced at Keanu. "You know him?" Keanu inclined his head slightly. "We've crossed paths." Dean nodded. "I'm here because your courtroom just became ground zero for something much bigger than zoning laws." Atkins felt his throat tighten. "Explain." Dean turned toward Keanu. "You're exposed," he said quietly. "We intercepted chatter this morning. They're closing in." Keanu's jaw tightened. "How soon?" Dean hesitated. "Soon enough that we need to move." Atkins stood abruptly. "Hold on. I'm the presiding authority in this courtroom. You don't get to just walk in here and—" Dean cut him off. "Judge, this isn't about authority anymore. It's about survival." The judge fell silent. He looked at Keanu, then at the badge still resting on the table. His fingers reached for it, holding it like an anchor in a rising storm. "This Blackthorne?" he said, his voice low. "What is it, really?" Keanu's eyes darkened. "It was a project, an unofficial task force. We handled threats before they became threats. No rules, no oversight." Atkins' grip tightened on the badge. "And now?" "Now someone's bringing it back," Keanu said, "but not for the right reasons." Agent Dean nodded grimly. "We believe they're using old networks, cleaning up anyone who knows too much." "Which includes me," Keanu added. The judge's head spun. "And me?" he asked. Dean hesitated, then, "You're sitting across from him in an open court. You've seen his credentials. That makes you a liability." Atkins sank slowly back into his chair. His hands trembled so hard he had to fold them on the desk to keep them steady. Keanu watched him with something that might have been sympathy. "I didn't want to involve anyone else," he said quietly, "but I couldn't stay quiet." Dean stepped forward. "We need to move, now." The judge looked around his courtroom. The familiar space that had once made him feel in control now felt foreign. The walls seemed closer, the windows darker. He glanced again at Keanu. "Why me? Why here?" Keanu rose to his feet. "Because this is where I thought I could still be safe." Dean turned toward the door. "We need to go." Atkins pushed to his feet unsteadily. "Go where?" Keanu picked up the badge and slipped it back inside his jacket. "Somewhere they won't expect?" The bailiff stood frozen near the door, his hand still resting on his holster, unsure whether to stay or follow. Dean opened the door. "Judge, you have 5 seconds to decide if you want to live." Atkins glanced once more at his bench, his gavel, the symbols of justice he'd believed in for decades. Then he exhaled slowly. "Lead the way." They left the courtroom in silence. The wind outside was cold, and the sky had darkened. Judge Atkins realized with a deep chill in his bones that the world he thought he knew was gone. And Keanu Reeves wasn't just a movie star. He was something else entirely, and the storm had only just begun. The heavy oak door to the private chambers closed behind them with a quiet but definitive click. Judge Amos Atkins stood near his desk, staring at the DHS agent and the man he thought he'd understood until this very day. Keanu Reeves. Actor. Quiet man. Charitable soul. But now, something far more dangerous. Special Agent Marcus Dean moved swiftly, closing the blinds and scanning the windows for any signs of movement. Keanu remained still, his calm presence contrasting with the rising tension in the room. Judge Atkins wiped the sweat from his brow, his hands still trembling slightly. "Sit down, Judge," Agent Dean said without looking back. It wasn't a suggestion. Atkins obeyed, settling into the worn leather chair behind his desk. The gavel still lay there, a hollow symbol of order and justice in a world that suddenly felt lawless. Keanu finally spoke. His voice was steady, low, but there was weight behind every word. "You need to understand what's happening here, Judge. Blackthorne was never meant to see daylight again. We were ghosts for a reason, but ghosts, they don't always stay buried." Atkins swallowed hard. "I don't understand. You said you were recruited, that you served in this Blackthorne." Keanu nodded slowly. "I was one of many. We handled what no one else could. Missions no government could acknowledge, threats no one ever wanted to admit existed." He paused for a moment before adding, "We eliminated them before they became headlines, before they became wars." Agent Dean stepped forward, a thick folder in his hand. He laid it gently on the desk in front of Atkins. "These are redacted files, Judge. Barely a fraction of the truth, but enough to give you a glimpse of what we're dealing with." Atkins hesitated before opening the folder. Grainy black and white photos, maps, names, faces crossed out in thick black lines. Some of them had dates scribbled in red. All of them were dead. "Logan Pierce," Dean said quietly, tapping one name with his finger. "Ex-Blackthorne. Now rogue. He's not erasing his own past. He's erasing the program, and anyone connected to it, which includes me," Keanu added. His tone was colder now. "I'm the last name on his list, the last loose end." Atkins shook his head slowly. "Why? Why now?" Keanu leaned back slightly in his chair. "Someone's trying to bring Blackthorne back, but not under government control. Private, off the leash. Pierce is tying up the past so there's no one left to expose him when it happens." Dean nodded grimly. "And if he succeeds, Judge, it won't just be Keanu who disappears. It'll be anyone he considers a threat." The judge set the folder down slowly. His mouth was dry. "I'm not a threat." Keanu's gaze didn't waver. "You are now." For a long moment, there was only silence. The ticking of a clock on the far wall sounded unnaturally loud. Atkins finally spoke, his voice tight. "You're asking me to ignore the law, to rule in your favor." Keanu shook his head. "No. I'm telling you that if you rule against me, you expose me. You make it easier for them to find me. And when they find me, they won't just stop there. You'll be next. They'll tie up every thread." Agent Dean stepped closer. "We've confirmed surveillance on you, Judge, your home, your routines. You've already been flagged as a liability. Pierce's people know who you are." Atkins ran his hands over his face. His stomach churned. "I'm a judge," he muttered. "This was a zoning dispute." "It was never about zoning," Keanu said softly. "It was a test, to see if I was still alive, still ready to fight. You were just the entry point." Atkins stared at him for a long time. Then he pushed himself up from his chair, his knees stiff. He paced toward the window, stopping short when Dean's hand rested on his shoulder. "Don't," the agent warned. "We've already got 2 drones circling the block." Atkins let out a shaky breath and turned back to the 2 men. "What do you want me to do?" Keanu's reply was simple. "Delay the ruling. Buy me time." Atkins exhaled. "And then what?" Dean checked his watch. "And then we move you to a secure location." But before Atkins could answer, a sharp crack split the air. Glass exploded inward from the window, shards spinning through the air like razors. Instinct took over. Agent Dean lunged toward the judge, dragging him down to the floor as another shot blasted through the room. Keanu was already moving. He drew a sidearm from beneath his jacket, low and efficient, scanning the room in one smooth motion. "Sniper," he said tightly. "We're compromised." Dean pushed Atkins behind the heavy oak desk, covering him with his own body. "Stay down." Keanu moved toward the window, keeping his body low. Another shot punched through the wall near his shoulder. "They're close," he muttered. "Rooftop." Dean grabbed the radio clipped to his vest. "Team 2, we've got shooters. Northwest rooftop, return fire." A crackle of static. "Copy that, engaging." More shots rang out, this time from outside. Keanu glanced toward Atkins. "They're not here for you yet, Judge, but they will be." Atkins' heart pounded in his chest. What happens if they get in? Keanu's eyes were flat and steady. They won't. The next few minutes were a blur of controlled chaos. Dean's team swept the surrounding rooftops, returning fire with surgical precision. Keanu covered the stairwell, anticipating a breach that never came. When the gunfire finally stopped, the silence that followed was deafening. Dean tapped his earpiece. A crackle. "Clear. One hostile down, no sign of others." Keanu exhaled slowly, lowering his weapon. They were probing, testing our response. Atkins slowly rose from behind the desk, his face pale. That wasn't an attempt. That was a message. Keanu nodded. They know we're watching, and they're escalating. Dean turned toward the judge. "We need to get you out of here. Now." But Atkins stood firm. "No, not until I do my job." He moved back toward his bench, his step steadier now despite everything. He picked up his gavel and stared at it for a moment before setting it down again. "I'll delay the ruling. I'll bury it in red tape if I have to, but I can't stop what's coming next." Keanu gave him a faint nod. "No one can, but we can buy time." Dean tapped his radio again. "Evac in 5. Keanu holstered his weapon and approached the judge. "You're doing the right thing. It's not about the law anymore. It's about survival." Atkins looked at him, something resigned in his expression. "You didn't choose this life, did you?" Keanu gave a faint smile. "No, but I'm still here." 5 minutes later, they left the courthouse through an underground passage few knew existed. Dean's team had cleared the area, but Keanu moved with the same quiet vigilance he always had, watching every shadow, scanning every corner. When they reached the armored SUV waiting at the far end of the alley, Atkins hesitated before climbing in. He glanced back at the building where he'd spent half his life handing down decisions, believing in order. Now he wasn't sure what he believed. Keanu's voice was quiet beside him. "It's not over." Atkins nodded. "I know." As the door closed behind them and the convoy pulled away, Keanu's words echoed in the judge's mind. Old ghosts don't die easy, and this war was only beginning. The armored SUV rumbled over the dirt road, leaving the small-town courthouse behind as dusk settled like a heavy blanket over Wyoming. Inside, Judge Amos Atkins sat stiffly, his mind replaying everything that had happened in the last few hours. Every decision, every revelation. His knuckles were white where he clutched the armrest. Keanu Reeves sat across from him, silent and composed. His eyes were steady, watching the horizon as if he could see what was coming long before anyone else. "You ever get scared?" Judge Atkins asked suddenly, his voice low. Keanu's answer was simple. "Only when I stop paying attention." They drove another mile in silence before the SUV slowed. Up ahead was Keanu's property, nestled at the base of low mountains and surrounded by dense pine. The guest house in question rose in the distance, larger than the judge had expected. But now, knowing it was more than just a guest house, he understood its design. Reinforced walls, narrow windows, and the faint shimmer of security measures layered across the perimeter. "You call this a safe house?" Atkins muttered. Keanu's lips curved into something that might have been a smile. Safer than most. The SUV rolled to a stop inside a concealed garage carved into the hillside. As the reinforced doors slid shut behind them, Agent Marcus Dean nodded toward Keanu. "We'll hold the perimeter as long as we can." Keanu returned the nod but said nothing. He led the judge through a winding corridor, descending deeper into the heart of the safe house. They moved past rooms filled with tactical gear, computer equipment, and surveillance monitors, cycling through endless camera feeds. Eventually, they reached a control room where another man waited. Joseph Tanner. Tanner rose slowly from where he'd been seated at a workbench, eyes narrowing at Atkins before turning to Keanu. He was lean, hardened by years of work in the shadows. His face was lined, his hair gray at the temples, but there was no mistaking the energy that radiated from him. This was a man who had survived what others hadn't. "You brought company," Tanner said flatly. Keanu nodded once. "Judge Amos Atkins, he's in it now." Tanner gave a brief, assessing nod. "You told him?" "Enough," Keanu replied, "but he needs to hear it from you." Tanner gave a tight smile. "All right then." He crossed the room and tapped a digital display. A map sprang to life, highlighting multiple regions across the country, each marked in red. Pierce isn't just hunting old ghosts. He's assembling something worse. A private army built on the bones of Blackthorne. No oversight, no conscience, just power. Atkins frowned, stepping closer. "But why? What's the end game?" Keanu's gaze was cold. "Control. Governments rise and fall. But power, in the shadows? That lasts." Tanner folded his arms. "Pierce plans to offer his services to the highest bidder. Entire governments for sale. Assassinations, coups. Blackthorne was dangerous when it answered to Washington. This new version answers to no one." Atkins let out a slow breath. "And you think I can stop this?" "You can delay it," Keanu said. "Long enough for us to move." The judge glanced between them. "Move where?" Before either man could answer, a low alarm sounded. Red lights blinked on the perimeter map. Tanner moved instantly, his fingers flying over the keyboard. The camera feeds shifted, revealing dark shapes moving through the tree line. "He took their here," Tanner said grimly. Keanu's expression didn't change. He strapped on his gear with quiet efficiency, then handed a sidearm to Atkins. The judge stared at it for a moment before taking it, his hand uncertain. "Know how to shoot?" Keanu asked. "Not like you," Atkins admitted. "Point, breathe, pull," Keanu said. "Aim at the ones who don't blink." The room shook as an explosion rocked the outer perimeter. Tanner glanced at Keanu. "They're moving fast." "Expected," Keanu replied. He slung a rifle over his shoulder and checked the ammunition. "We hold them as long as we can. Then we run." Atkins' stomach twisted. "Run where?" Keanu's eyes flickered toward a thick steel door at the back of the room. "There's a tunnel system. Leads out past the ridgeline." Tanner gave a half smile. "Always thinking ahead, Reeves." Keanu loaded a final magazine. "I've had time." The security monitors showed tactical teams breaching the outer gate. Suppressed weapons, black gear, silent coordination. Professionals. Keanu moved to a defensive position near the reinforced front entrance. Tanner took up position by the window, his rifle sighted and steady. Atkins stayed low, gripping his sidearm like it might bite him. "What do I do?" "Stay behind cover," Keanu said, "and if they get too close, pull the trigger." The first wave hit hard. Explosions against the reinforced walls, smoke grenades through shattered windows, muffled shouts in tight formation. Keanu and Tanner moved like they'd done this 100 times before. Calm, precise, deadly. Keanu's rifle barked 3 times, each shot deliberate. One man dropped instantly, another fell trying to flank through the side door. Tanner's shots came slower but no less accurate. He worked with a sniper's patience, waiting until his target made a mistake. Atkins crouched behind a steel support beam, his heart pounding in his chest. The gun in his hands felt heavier than he imagined. He watched Keanu and Tanner work, both men calm under fire, communicating in short glances and gestures. There was no panic, just purpose. Then he saw movement, too close. A figure broke through the smoke, weapon raised. Instinct screamed at him. Atkins lifted the sidearm, his hands shaking. He squeezed the trigger. The shot was louder than he expected, deafening in the enclosed space. The figure crumpled without a sound. Atkins stared at the gun in his hand. He had fired and killed. Keanu glanced back once, offering a nod of approval. Good. Another explosion rocked the structure. Tanner ducked as debris rained from the ceiling. We're running out of time. Keanu checked his watch. We move. Now. Tanner nodded, dropping a flashbang before retreating to the rear door. Keanu herded the judge toward the tunnel entrance. Atkins stumbled but kept moving, his mind reeling from what he had just done. They descended quickly, the tunnel lit only by dim emergency lights. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of earth and old concrete. Keanu led the way, Tanner bringing up the rear. As they moved, Keanu's voice was quiet but steady. This was never about survival, Judge. It's about protecting what matters. Atkins swallowed hard, his mind racing. And what's that? Keanu's reply was simple. The people who still believe, there's hope. They moved through the tunnels in silence, the echoes of gunfire fading behind them. When they emerged on the far side of the ridge, the moon hung low over the mountains. A waiting vehicle stood by, camouflage netting peeled away as Tanner pulled it free. Keanu turned to the judge. You have a choice now. Go back to your life, pretend none of this happened, or stay. Help stop what's coming. Atkins looked back toward the smoke rising from the valley. He thought of the bullet he fired, the man he killed. He thought of the law, how fragile it had suddenly become, and he made his choice. I'm in. Keanu nodded once. Good. As they climbed into the vehicle and drove into the night, the safe house burned behind them. The war wasn't over. It had only just begun. The drive from the burning safe house was quiet, though the silence carried the weight of everything they had just survived. Keanu Reeves sat behind the wheel, his hand steady on the cracked leather steering wheel of the old pickup. Joseph Tanner rode shotgun, his shotgun across his lap, his eyes constantly scanning the dark horizon. Judge Amos Atkins sat in the back, his mind reeling, his heart still pounding from the firefight they had barely escaped. The safe house was gone. Keanu's last piece of protection, the one place where he thought he could stay ahead of the shadows, reduced to rubble and smoke. But he wasn't thinking about that now. He was thinking about what came next. Tanner spoke first, his voice low. We can make it to the cabin before dawn. Keanu gave a quiet nod. We'll regroup there, lay low, plan. Atkins swallowed hard, his voice rough. Plan what? Keanu didn't take his eyes off the road. Our next move. The judge had never felt more uncertain. Just 12 hours earlier, he'd been presiding over a zoning dispute, dismissing Keanu Reeves as a washed-up celebrity clinging to a guest house. Now, he sat in the back seat of a truck, driven by a man who had moved through a gunfight with the precision of a surgeon and the calm of a monk. And he'd killed a man. That truth gnawed at him in the silence. They reached Tanner's remote cabin just as the first faint glow of dawn broke over the distant ridges. The cabin was small, tucked deep in a forest no GPS had ever mapped. It was clear Tanner had designed it as a last refuge, a place where people went when they didn't want to be found. As Keanu killed the engine, the three men sat there for a moment in silence, letting the stillness of the forest settle around them. Then Keanu opened his door and stepped out, his boots crunching softly against the gravel. Tanner followed, his shotgun still close. We'll need to sweep the perimeter, he said. Keanu nodded. I'll take east. Judge Atkins watched them move like ghosts, quiet and controlled. He stepped out slowly, his body aching with exhaustion, and stood in the clearing. The cold morning air bit through his clothes, but it was the reality of where he was that truly made him shiver. A judge, a man of laws, courts, and order. now standing in a war he didn't understand. 20 minutes later, they reconvened inside the cabin. Tanner locked the heavy wooden door behind him, bolting it in 3 places, then pulled down blackout shades on the windows. Keanu started a fire in the old stone hearth, the flames crackling and spitting sparks into the darkness. They sat in the living room, the firelight dancing across their faces. Tanner poured 3 glasses of something dark and strong. They drank in silence at first. Finally, Atkins spoke. "You were an actor, a movie star. How does that fit into this?" Keanu's gaze was steady, but there was something distant in his expression, as if he were looking at something long buried. "The acting came later," he said quietly. "After Blackthorne." Atkins frowned. "You were recruited before Hollywood?" Keanu nodded. "I was young, angry, fast on a motorcycle and faster with my hands. Someone noticed. Said I could be useful." Tanner chuckled dryly. "And he was. One of the best." Keanu's face remained still. "I did things I won't forget. Some I can't forgive. But it was always for a reason, or so I told myself." Atkins rubbed his face with a shaking hand. "And the movies?" Keanu shrugged. "An exit, or maybe a cover, maybe both." The judge leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "In court, I laughed at you." His voice was hoarse, guilt riding his words. "I thought you were playing a part." Keanu's gaze softened slightly. "We all laugh at things we don't understand." Tanner finished his drink in a single swallow. "Understanding's overrated," he muttered. "Survival is better." Keanu's eyes flickered to Tanner, then back to the judge. "We survive by knowing what's coming next." Atkins sighed. "You think Pierce will come after us again?" Keanu's reply was quiet but certain. "I know he will." Tanner stood and walked over to a table cluttered with maps, files, and old intelligence reports. He picked up a folder and flipped it open, revealing grainy photos, some decades old. Others were recent, too recent. Fires, burned-out buildings, unexplained deaths. The headlines were cryptic. House fire claims former intelligence officer. Retired diplomat found dead in apparent suicide. Industrial accident kills defense contractor. Tanner dropped the photos on the table. Blackthorne's ghosts aren't just disappearing. They're being erased. Keanu stepped closer. Pierce is tying up loose ends, and he's moving faster. Atkins stared at the images, his stomach turning. "How long do we have?" Tanner glanced at Keanu, deferring the answer. Keanu shook his head. "Not long." The judge felt a wave of helplessness. "What are we supposed to do? Run forever? Hide?" Keanu shook his head again. "We stop running. We find Langley." Tanner nodded. He was Pierce's handler, the one who knows where the bodies are buried. Atkins frowned. "And where is he?" Tanner gave a grim smile. "That's the million-dollar question." Keanu picked up another folder and flipped it open. A map of Arizona. "Red Mesa," he said. "Last sighting." Tanner sighed. "If he's still alive." Atkins shook his head. "And if he's not?" Keanu closed the folder. "Then we're on our own." The weight of the situation settled like a stone in the pit of the judge's stomach. He glanced at Keanu. "Why are you doing this? You could have disappeared. You could have stayed hidden." Keanu's expression didn't change, but there was something deeper in his voice when he answered, "Because someone has to stand between them and the rest of the world." Tanner chuckled softly. "Always the noble one." Keanu didn't smile. "Some things are worth protecting." Atkins exhaled slowly, the firelight flickering across his face. "And me? Why did you bring me into this?" Keanu looked at him steadily. "Because you were already in it. They marked you the moment you laughed at me in court." The judge nodded slowly. "Then let's finish it." Tanner smirked. "You're learning, Judge." They spent the rest of the night making plans, routes, supplies, weapons. The world outside the cabin was still and quiet, but in that silence, they knew danger was gathering. And when the sun rose over the Wyoming mountains, the three men were already moving. Because Blackthorne wasn't done, and neither were they. The Arizona sun burned high overhead, relentless and punishing. Red Mesa was barely a town, more of a last refuge where people either didn't want to be found or had nowhere left to go. It was here, at the edge of the world, that they found him. Victor Langley. The man who had once orchestrated operations that changed the course of nations now lived in a battered trailer on the outskirts of a ghost town. Dust coated everything. The shutters were always closed. There were no neighbors, no visitors. Except now. Keanu Reeves stood in front of the trailer door, his jaw tight. Joseph Tanner watched his six, his hand resting casually on the grip of a compact shotgun slung under his arm. Judge Amos Atkins shifted uncomfortably, the dry heat and the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on him. Keanu knocked twice. Slow. Deliberate. Nothing. Then a voice. Hoarse, ragged, but alert. "You weren't supposed to find me." Keanu's answer was calm. "We always find our own." A pause. Then, the door creaked open. A single dark eye appeared in the crack between chain locks. "Reeves. Langley. You're supposed to be dead." Keanu allowed himself the faintest smile. "Aren't we all?" The door unlatched. Slowly. Langley stood there, thinner than Keanu remembered, his hair more white than gray, but his eyes still cut through everything. Inside, the trailer was Spartan. Maps, files, and hand-drawn diagrams covered every surface. A single rifle rested against the window ledge. A backup pistol lay in plain sight on the table. There was no coffee brewing, no signs of life, just survival. Tanner entered first, scanning the room automatically. Satisfied, he gave Keanu a slight nod. Langley leaned against the wall and studied them. His gaze lingered on Atkins. "You're the judge." Atkins nodded. "I was. 2 weeks ago, I was worried about noise ordinances and property lines. Now I'm alive," Langley cut in. "For now." Keanu sat down across from him. "We need answers." Langley let out a dry, hollow laugh. "You don't need answers. You need a miracle." "Pierce," Keanu said, cutting to the point. "We know he's rebuilding." Langley's jaw flexed. He said nothing for a moment. Then he reached behind a stack of papers and pulled out a flash drive. He tossed it on the table, where it landed with a soft clatter. "You're late." Keanu picked it up. "What's on it?" "Everything," Langley said. "Blueprints, contacts, financials." "Pierce isn't rebuilding Blackthorne, Reeves. He's repurposing it, turning it into something far worse." Tanner crossed his arms. "Define worse." Langley's eyes darkened. "Private sector. No oversight. Governments hire them, but they're loyal to the highest bidder. Assassinations, coups, covert destabilization, cyber warfare. If Pierce succeeds, there won't be any countries left. Just clients." Atkins let out a slow breath. "And the safe house?" Langley shrugged. It was a testing ground. He wanted to see if Reeves still had the instinct. If he didn't, they would have wiped him out quietly. But he fought back. Now Pierce knows he has a problem. Keanu's face remained unreadable. Then let's be his bigger problem. For the next 3 hours, they pored over Langley's files. Maps marked with red circles, supply routes, safe houses, operative lists, all of it raw intelligence collected by Langley during his years in hiding. Piece by piece, they connected the dots. Pierce's network was global. He was moving faster than they had feared. Some countries were already unknowingly using his services, hiring Blackthorne agents under new names and corporations. Langley tapped one file with his finger. "These are DHS assets. Some of them know, some of them don't, but it's time to bring them in." Tanner nodded. "And what about you?" Langley's expression was tired. I've done my part. It's your turn now." That night, they made contact with DHS Director Evelyn Park. The moment she saw the intel, she dispatched an extraction team to Red Mesa. Within 12 hours, they were relocated to a secure black site. Atkins spent the entire flight reviewing his own notes. He wasn't a soldier or a spy, but he was something Pierce hadn't accounted for. A witness. A judge who now understood the stakes. 2 days later, behind closed doors in a fortified courtroom, Judge Amos Atkins gave testimony to DHS, to the Pentagon, to men and women who hadn't believed Blackthorne existed. He described the safe house, the firefight, the attack on his home, Keanu's badge, Pierce's reach. He expected disbelief. What he got was fear. And they listened. Keanu never spoke in those hearings. He sat in the back, silent, watching, letting the facts speak for themselves. Afterward, Director Park approached him. "You could be a hero." Keanu shook his head. "The work matters, not the glory." She studied him for a moment, then nodded. "We'll keep you out of the reports, but you know this isn't over." Keanu's response was a quiet truth. It never is. By the end of the week, DHS and what was left of Keanu's old network began working together. Raids, black bag operations, cutting the legs out from under Pierce's new empire. Quietly, efficiently. Keanu refused to stay for the cleanup. Tanner and Atkins understood. One morning, Judge Atkins woke up to find a note slipped under his hotel door. "You stood between the law and chaos. You chose well." K.R. He never saw Keanu again, but his presence lingered. Weeks later, a mural appeared on the courthouse wall in Jackson, Wyoming. No one claimed credit for it. It showed a lone figure on a motorcycle, riding into the horizon. Below it, the words, "Quiet leaders change the world." Tourists started taking photos of it. Locals began to talk about the quiet man who'd once stood in their courtroom. Some said he was just an actor. Others knew better. Amos Atkins continued his career, but he was different now. He presided over cases with a new understanding of what justice truly meant, of what leadership really required. It wasn't showmanship. It was integrity. Joseph Tanner disappeared from official records soon after. Word was he went back underground, cleaning up what Pierce had started. Some said he was hunting ghosts. Others said he had become one. As for Keanu Reeves, there were sightings. A motorcycle spotted on empty highways, a man matching his description helping to rebuild an orphanage in Guatemala, a large donation made anonymously to a children's hospital in Los Angeles. But he never returned to Hollywood, never gave interviews, never stepped back into the limelight. The world kept spinning, unaware of how close it had come to spinning out of control. And that was how Keanu wanted it. Quiet, unseen, but not forgotten. Because some wars are fought in silence, and the real leaders never need applause. 1 year had passed, 12 months since Judge Amos Atkins stood frozen in a small Wyoming courtroom, staring at a badge that changed everything. It felt like a lifetime ago. The courtroom, the firefight, the revelations about Blackthorne, like scenes from a movie he never wanted to star in. And yet here he was, standing at the edge of a lush, green park in Denver, Colorado. It was a charity fundraiser for children's hospitals, a low-key event, intentionally kept quiet to avoid drawing crowds or media attention. Just families, kids, volunteers, and one man who, until now, he wasn't sure he'd ever see again. Keanu Reeves knelt in the grass, tying the loose shoelaces of a young boy. The child, maybe 5 or 6 years old, beamed at him with pure joy as Keanu gave him a playful salute before sending him off toward a game of catch. There were no cameras nearby, no paparazzi, no flashes, just a quiet moment between a man and a child. Judge Atkins watched from a distance, his hands resting loosely in his jacket pockets. He took a breath. Slow, reflective. 1 year ago, he'd laughed at that man in court, thought he was just another celebrity clinging to relevance. Now he knew better. Keanu stood up slowly, dusting off his jeans. His hair was longer now, tucked behind his ears. There was a lightness to his expression that Atkins hadn't seen before, not even in those moments after they'd escaped the safe house. It was a peace, hard-earned, and not easily explained. As if sensing he was being watched, Keanu glanced over his shoulder. His gaze found Atkins in the crowd immediately. For a second, neither man moved. Then Keanu gave a simple nod. Not an invitation, not a summons, just acknowledgement. Atkins nodded back. He wanted to walk over, to talk to him, ask him how he was, what he was doing now. But the moment passed before he could move, and Keanu was already turning away, moving toward a small group of volunteers handing out food, blending into the crowd with the same ease he had blended into the shadows. Atkins let out a slow breath and shook his head, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. He wasn't sure he'd ever truly understand the man, but he understood one thing now. Keanu Reeves didn't need recognition. He didn't want headlines or speeches. He just wanted to make a difference. As Atkins turned to leave, his phone buzzed. A notification. He pulled it from his pocket and glanced at the screen. The Man Who Chose Silence. A new segment from Fiona Carrington. Curious, he tapped the video and watched as Fiona sat in a quiet studio, her tone softer than he had ever heard it before. There was no panel, no interruptions, just her and the camera. "A year ago," she began, "I interviewed a man who redefined strength for me. A man whose silence was louder than any debate I'd ever hosted. Today, I want to honor him, not as an actor or an icon, but as a quiet leader." Images faded in behind her, a motorcycle on an empty highway, a worn leather jacket hanging over the back of a chair, a pair of hands gently tying a child's shoes. He asked for no credit, he sought no glory, and yet his actions changed lives, saved them. Sometimes the world needs a loud voice, but more often it needs someone who listens, someone who stands quietly for what's right. Atkins' eyes softened as he watched. Fiona smiled gently in the video. "This is for you, Keanu Reeves." The video ended with a simple quote on the screen. "Quiet leaders change the world." Atkins slipped his phone back into his pocket and stared out at the park. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the grass. Children laughed in the distance. Somewhere nearby, someone strummed a guitar. And then he heard it, the familiar low growl of an engine. He turned just in time to see Keanu Reeves mount his black motorcycle. He swung one leg over, settling into the seat with a practiced ease. No fanfare, no farewell speech, just a man on a journey. Keanu slid his helmet on and gave one final glance back toward the park. For a moment his eyes found Atkins again. There was no smile this time, just understanding. Then the engine roared and he was gone, riding off into the fading sun, the horizon wide open before him. Atkins stood there for a long time after, watching the empty road, thinking, remembering. He thought about that courtroom, about the disbelief and the laughter, about how he had almost ruled against Keanu, almost made a decision that could have gotten him killed, and worse, doomed countless others. But he hadn't, because Keanu had shown him something he'd never seen in all his years on the bench. Not just courage, not just strength, but grace. The kind that doesn't need to raise its voice to be heard. The kind that stands quietly when the world demands noise. Atkins exhaled slowly, his breath fogging in the cooling evening air. Then he turned and walked away, back toward his car, back toward his life. He wasn't sure if he'd ever see Keanu again. But he knew this. He didn't need to. Keanu was out there, somewhere, riding into places no one would ever see, standing for people who would never know his name, protecting what mattered. And maybe that was enough. As he reached his car, Atkins paused one last time and looked up at the sky. The sunset blazed in brilliant streaks of red and orange across the horizon. Then his gaze dropped to the courthouse in the distance, where the mural had been repainted, fresh and bright. Quiet leaders change the world. He smiled, soft, proud, then climbed into his car and drove away. And somewhere, far down a quiet highway, a lone motorcycle rode into the night. As the dust settled on a story few people would ever know, one truth remained. Keanu Reeves never asked for recognition. He never sought headlines, accolades, or applause. He simply chose to do what was right, quietly, when no one was watching. And that is where true leadership lives. It's not in grand speeches or crowded rallies. It's not in the loudest voice or the biggest platform. It's in the quiet moments, when the easy choice is to walk away, but a person stays. When the world demands noise, but someone chooses silence because they understand the real work happens in the stillness. Keanu Reeves had spent years being seen as a Hollywood star, a man of few words, known for his kindness and humility, but behind that calm exterior was something far greater, a quiet strength forged in shadows, honed by sacrifice, and tempered with unwavering integrity. His story teaches us something powerful. Integrity doesn't need applause, it needs courage. The courage to stand alone when no one else will. The courage to protect others without asking for anything in return. The courage to live by values that cannot be bought, traded, or compromised. In a world that often rewards the loudest voice, the flashiest image, and the most controversial opinions, Keanu's story reminds us that there's a different kind of strength. The kind that doesn't shout, it whispers, and when it speaks, people listen. Some of the greatest leaders in history didn't stand at podiums demanding attention. They worked quietly in the background, making decisions that saved lives and shaped futures. They were the protectors, the listeners, and the steady hands guiding others through the storm. That's who Keanu Reeves chose to be. He didn't come to court that day to win an argument. He didn't flash his badge to gain power. He came to protect something, and someone. That mattered. And in doing so, he risked everything, knowing most people would never know his name, much less understand the sacrifice. But he did it anyway. And that, friends, is the essence of true leadership. So now I ask you, have you ever seen quiet leadership in action? Have you ever witnessed someone stand for what's right, not because they wanted recognition, but because they knew it was the right thing to do? Maybe it was a teacher who stayed late to help us. Maybe it was a neighbor who helped without being asked. Maybe it was a parent, a mentor, or a friend who offered strength and support when you needed it most. We all have stories like that, stories of people who led not with noise, but with grace. And I'd love to hear yours. Drop a comment below and tell us about a time you saw quiet leadership in action. Whether it was a moment you'll never forget, or someone who made a difference in your life without ever asking for credit, share it with us. These stories deserve to be told because they remind us of the kind of world we can create when we lead with integrity and courage. And if you believe in standing for what's right, if you believe in the power of quiet leadership, do me a favor. You like this video? Share Keanu's incredible story with someone who needs to hear it. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Stories that remind us of the strength in silence, the courage in humility, and the power of doing what's right, even when no one is watching. Because that's how we change the world, one quiet leader at a time. Keanu Reeves may have ridden off into the sunsets in this story. He may have left the courthouse, the safe house, and the fight behind. But his legacy, the lessons he left behind, still echo today. And they always will. Thank you for watching. Until next time, stay strong, stay kind, and remember, true strength isn't in making noise. It's in standing quietly for what's right.